Hello, this is Diane Myers from Texas Women's University, and today we'll be talking about PBIS in the classroom, expectations. How do we make sure that students follow our expectations? First, we define each expectation ahead of time. We've already done this in your classroom matrix. Then, we teach each expectation. We prompt students to meet expectations, and we'll be talking about teaching and prompting expectations today. After instruction, we reinforce behavior that meets our expectations. Remember, reinforcing a behavior means that we're increasing the likelihood of that behavior happening in the future, and we certainly want to increase the likelihood that students will engage in behaviors that meet our expectations. Afterwards, we evaluate the effectiveness of our instruction, and we make any changes that we need to make based on the data we collect. Let's talk about teaching our expectations. Why do we need to teach expectations? Well, research has consistently shown us that in classes where routines are established on the first day of school, students are more engaged in academic activities and they tend to make more academic progress throughout the school year. Rules and expectations alone are not enough, though. Our expectations need to be implemented as part of a comprehensive instructional and behavioral system. We should not be thinking about academic supports and behavioral supports separately in our classrooms. Academics and behavior are both part of our overall instructional classroom management system. Our rules need to be consistent with the school's culture. This is why we like our class-wide expectations to align with our school's guidelines for success whenever possible. Our rules need to be taught explicitly, and they need to be reviewed regularly with students and staff. When we teach academics, we tend to follow a model similar to this. First, we explain what we're teaching to our students and we activate prior knowledge. For instance, if you were teaching multiplication, you would explain and define multiplication and show how it's connected to addition. Then, we model the skill we want our students to learn. With multiplication, we would show them examples on the board, we may use manipulatives to enhance our instruction, and we would find other ways to demonstrate exactly what multiplication looks like. After modeling, we give students an opportunity to practice the skill that we're teaching. For our multiplication example, this would look like giving students examples to work through themselves, maybe problems to work through with a partner or on the board, and throughout the practice phase of instruction, we give students a lot of feedback on their performance. If they're multiplying correctly, we tell them so. If they're making errors, we help them find where they're making errors and try again. If we find that our students are struggling, we reteach some of the content. For those students who continue to struggle after reteaching, we might meet with them one-on-one and see if they need some more intensive instruction. I want you to think about using the same model for teaching behaviors. If you have a particular behavior skill on which you're focusing, first, explain that skill to your students. If you want students to raise their hands in the classroom, explain that, define it for them, and tell them what it looks like in the context of your routines. You would say, today we're going to talk about raising our hands. This is part of being respectful during teacher-led instruction. If you want to get my attention, you need to raise your hand appropriately. Then you model the behavioral skill that you want your students to use. For this example, you would raise your hand high in the air, make eye contact with the teacher, and sit quietly in your seat. You model for the students exactly what this looks like. In addition, you also want to model what the behavior does not look like. So you would show them a non-example where you're waving your hand and making noise trying to get the teacher's attention. So you model examples of the appropriate behavior for your students. Then you give students a chance to practice the new behavior. So you might ask a couple of questions and have students practice raising their hand. You might give students worksheets with very difficult problems or purposely incorrect information, so students will have to raise their hand to get your attention. When they do so, give them feedback that they're performing the skill correctly, or if they're not performing the skill correctly, make sure you give them some corrective feedback. If students seem to need more help, reteach hand raising to the whole group, and for students who make persistent errors, see if they might benefit from some one-on-one instruction. In short, behavioral expectations should be taught just like we teach academic skills. This means that teachers should define their classroom behavioral expectations, which you've already done, Model examples and non-examples of the expected behaviors. I mentioned that in the previous slide. As a caveat, make sure that the teacher is the one modeling non-examples. We don't want students accidentally being reinforced by their peers' laughter if they're engaging in a non-example of the behavior. Lead activities where students have the chance to practice the skill and where you can give them a lot of descriptive feedback on their performance of that skill. Then, after the lesson, be sure to prompt for the use of the new skill. Before you have a discussion or before you hand out a worksheet, you'll want to say, remember what it looks like to get my attention. Show me how to raise your hand appropriately. That would be an example of a prompt. After teaching, periodically check in on students' retention of the skill. Again, you could ask before a lesson if anybody remembers how to get your attention appropriately, if you want to check on if they're retaining the skill. Also, you'll know if they're retaining the skill if they're continuing to engage in the behavior even when not prompted. We cannot assume that all students know how to behave without explicit instruction. In some classrooms, it's okay to call out without raising your hand, so the expectation might not be consistent from class to class. That's why it's important to teach the expectations for your classroom. We can't assume that all students are going to know how to behave unless we tell them exactly what we expect. When students make behavioral errors, remember to correct those errors just like we correct academic errors. First, we reteach the expected behavior. We provide additional practice for those students who need it. We always reinforce as soon as we see the correct behavior so students will know that they've done it correctly. If the students continue to make errors, we follow up with more intensive support, but not until we've tried reteaching and reinforcing the appropriate behavior whenever we see it. Let's talk a little bit about prompting. Teachers should be using prompts and pre-corrects to enhance behavioral expectation instruction. A prompt is when we add a stimulus to the environment to increase the likelihood that the antecedent stimulus will occasion the appropriate behavior. What that means is that we add something to the environment to make it more likely students will engage in the behavior we've taught. A pre-correct is a fancy kind of prompt that we use in a situation where there's a high likelihood of problem behavior. For instance, if our students have struggled at assemblies before, while we're on our way to the assembly, you would say, remember what it looks like to be respectful during an assembly, eyes on the speaker and feet on the floor. That would be an example of a pre-correct. Prompts should use specific language from your matrix. For example, as students are lining up, you say, remember what it looks like to be safe while you're lining up, hands at your sides and eyes on your own belongings. Prompts in the classroom can be verbal. For example, remember to raise your hand if you want to participate. They can be visual. For example, a poster reminding students to recycle, or a poster of your class-wide expectations or matrix. Prompts can also be gestural, where you point towards the homework bin as students enter the room. For your teaching expectations timeline, in the short term, review your matrix with students. Then, decide on a schedule for teaching content in the matrix. You could teach the content by guideline for success. For example, spend some time working on respectful, then move on to ready to learn. You could teach by classroom routine. For example, maybe you begin with what the guidelines for success look like at arrival, then you move on to what the guidelines for success look like during independent seat work, and so forth. You could also address behaviors where students are making the most errors. For instance, if your students are having a hard time staying on task during group work, maybe you work on the expectations for group work first. In the long term, be sure that all of the behaviors in the matrix are going to be taught explicitly and have a plan for doing so. Address any prerequisites if needed. For example, if you're going to talk about the expectations for a classroom discussion and contributing appropriately to classroom discussions, first make sure that students understand what it looks like to be on task and to raise hands to get attention. Make sure to provide plenty of supplemental instruction, that is, booster sessions, to ensure maintenance of skills. Just like with academics, we want to make sure that we're checking that students can maintain these skills over time. If you need any more information, please refer to the Student Services intranet website. Thank you.